Hello, my dear friends. What I want to do is apply the idea that I've raised in a previous video to the time of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. Because what the Prophet faced was a challenge of polytheism, of people who practiced shirk. And the concept of creating partners or co-opted sources of divine authority along with God is a very prominent feature in the struggle of the Prophet. And so I just want to raise that, and I want to do that at the hand of a few verses from the Qur'an, because the best source of history for us also is the Qur'an. And so particularly I want to look at this verse in chapter 10 verse 35. And for those who've asked me about the translation I use, I just want to again mention that I am undertaking the translation as a responsibility to my own family, friends, those who are on the channel, and I have progressed approximately 40% of the way now, and this is sort of a current chapter that I'm busy with, and that is why I raise these topics as I pick them up in the Holy Mus'haf, in the sacred text. And coincidentally, in the last few days, while I was working on chapter Yunus of chapter 10, I noticed that the word shirk comes up quite frequently, and that is why I decided to offer you to make this video, the previous video as well as this one. So in the previous video I mentioned to you that the prophets or the messengers of God did not just come to break idols like effigies and statues and little blocks and wooden objects and stone objects. They came to challenge any form of divine worship that was not to the one true God. And so the same with the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. He had the same mission to end polytheism. And what is meant by shirk? You see, shirk, like I said in the previous video, has been reduced, has been simplified, has been minimized to mean worshipping idols. And then the poor Hindus get the worst rap when it comes to Muslims, because Muslims just see that one sort of false worship as shirk. They don't see, they've forgotten about shirk, which involves the worship of men. And that is really what the message of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam was. He came to end the worship of man by man. And why do I say that? Look at this verse here, chapter 10 verse 35. Ask them, can any of the figures you co-opt alongside God point you to what is right? Now, before I continue, this is a verse which is revealed in Mecca, which is in the tough period of the prophets, of the messenger Muhammad alayhi salam's lifetime, when he is constantly engaged in debating and trying to deliver the message to the enemies or the detractors or the polytheists, which also included Christians and perhaps Jews, whatever. We know that the Prophet preached during Roman times, so there was a very arrogant Roman Empire that had suzerainty over the Arabian Peninsula, more or less. And so he had to deal with people who worship men. Their gods looked like men. The emperors they called God, like Julius Caesar was referred to as God. However, the Byzantines, they moved along, so they no longer had a pure polytheism, but they still regarded the emperor as, to a large extent, reflective or representative of the will of God. And so he had to deal with men worshipping men. Now let's look at the Quraysh, the tribes of Arabia. We know that those tribes consisted of a very, very powerful elite. And that elite were in charge of the holy sites. We know now that places like the Haram Sharif were pagan centers of worship. And what is today holy sites for Muslims were pagan holy sites. And the way it worked was that people would gather at these pagan sites. The Haram in Mecca was not the only site. There were many pagan centers of worship. And in those days, the center where people assembled to worship was also the hub, the economic hub. So people would assemble, they would pay the priest in charge of the holy site, and there was always a priest in charge of each holy site. They would, deliver or hand over some sort of payment, which could be in the form of livestock or any other form of produce, or they could just drop him a few silver coins, dirhams or dinar. What is the silver one? Dirham or dinar. And so the holy sites were sites of commerce. You see, they were business sites, and the business elite, the chieftains of the Arabs, the senior powerful tribes, were the merchants. They were in control of the imports and of the exports, and they used these holy sites as trade, as malls. You see, so these were the business of Arabia has always been trade, commerce, right? So there was some agriculture, but that was not where the Prophet started out. He started out in an area that was mostly commercial. And so when he went to Medina, of course, it became more of an agricultural environment. So what this verse is saying, picture that vision, picture that image, right? That context where the Prophet is delivering the message. And then we read this verse. Ask them, can any of the figures you co-opt alongside God point you to what is right? Then answer for them. The one true God points to what is right. So then, is that which points to what is right not entitled to followership? Is that, I repeat, is that which points to what is right not entitled to followership? And then the key point, rather than that which cannot point to what is right, except when it is shown the way. Very, very crucial, the last one. فَمَا لَكُمْ كَيْفَ لَا يَهْدِي إِلَّا أَنْ يُهْدَى إِلَّا أَنْ يُهْدَى. So that is an extremely important part here. إِلَّا أَنْ يُهْدَى. So those that people worship, the things that they worship, could not point them in the right direction unless they themselves were given the answers or what is right. So what we are saying here is the Prophet is addressing something other than statues here. He is referring here to those priests that were custodians of the holy sites, those pagan priests. Those pagan priests were on the payroll of the super rich elite, and those pagan priests were there to maintain and to perpetuate the system of idolatry, the system of false beliefs. And what this verse here is saying is those priests that you go to for divination, to be guided, to be given answers, to be told you're going to have a boy or you're going to have a girl, because that is what the priests were there for. The people would go to the priest and ask them for advice, and the priest would draw arrows or draw straws and would give them an answer, but these answers were completely random, and they were not based on anything that is true and in any way scientifically defensible. And so this verse is there to tell people that what you are following are people who themselves don't have the answers. They also need direction and help, and if they don't have it, they can't offer it. And so that, my friends, is the key point. It is one of the key verses that I have come across in chapter 10 verse 35, where you can see that the Prophet did not combat the worship of statues, but he came to combat the worship of these priests, and these priests were falsely guiding, were misguiding people, and these priests were on the payroll of the powerful elite. Doesn't that ring a bell? Doesn't that sound familiar to you? I mean, we're forever raising here the priests on the payroll. And right now, we see the exact replication, the exact repetition of that type of challenge. We have the priests who are being paid their salary by the Saudis and by the whoever else. And those priests are there to maintain the status quo. They come with all sorts of fancy arguments and fancy ideas to smuggle in their books besides the Qur'an, just as these priests use superstition and fallacies and fibs and folly to keep their false system in place. The same happens today. My friends, that is what the Prophet fought against. Now, yes, they had idols, but those idols, those little effigies, they were just little icons. They were just little emblems, symbols. It's like almost like today you say that, people walk around with a designer brand on their shirt or on their shoes. And the reason they do that is to show a token affiliation to a value system. So in other words, if I put on a set of sunshades or spectacles, and it doesn't have the logo, whatever, police or Ray-Bans, whatever, then I cannot be accredited for being true to the value system. So those effigies, the little statue of Hubal, the little statue of Lat and Uzza, those little statues were just symbols. They were just symbols, you see, of a value system. A value system that was based on fallacy, on superstition. And that, my friends, was what the Prophet Muhammad a.s. came to combat. Superstition, fallacy, guesswork, represented by a cadre or a generation of priests who were on the payroll of the rich elite and using effigies and statues as little symbols of that value system. Exactly what we are facing today. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil